Chapter 13, the South. Let's start talking about the growth of the cotton industry. Cotton was becoming more and more popular in the South and becoming a more or bigger cash crop. Where before the cash crops were like tobacco, rice, and indigo, cotton is one of those that are starting to become more popular. However, the problem with cotton is that the cotton, as you can see in the picture here, is a plant, and when you pick it, it has cotton seeds in it. And trying to remove those seeds is difficult as well as time consuming. So prior to any kind of machinery or anything to help with that, you had to do it by hand. And as cotton became more popular, it was harder to keep up with the demand for it. Eli Whitney, who we talked about in the last chapter, invented the cotton gin, a machine that removes seeds from a short staple cotton. So you put the cotton in, you spin it, the little teeth inside the machine will grab at the seeds and pull them out. Planters were large-scale farmers who held more than 20 slaves and used cotton gins that could process tons of cotton much faster than hand processing. So, I mean, imagine being someone who had to pick all of this and then having to de-seed it by hand. Seems like very hard work. Cotton production spread throughout the South, causing it to be known as the Cotton Belt. In Southern society, you really have two levels of farmers. You have the planters, who were the wealthiest members of society. They lived in large mansions like you see here in the picture and had the huge plantations with all the land and the crops on it. And because they were wealthy, they had great influence on the economy. So how a plantation does with its crops really dictates how well the South or that area is doing economically. However, less than a third of the population in the South had plantations. So there's only a small fraction of people who actually had one of these. So on those plantations, the male member of the family usually was concerned with raising the crops and supervising the slaves. The women ran the plantation household. Now, where the planters were the wealthiest and lowest part or percentage of the population, the majority of the population of farmers were called yeomen or yeomen, and they were owners of small farms, and they had either a few slaves or they had no slaves at all. The poorest of white Southerners could not grow cash crops. They just didn't have the land or the money to do that. So they just did regular farming maybe for themselves or something that you could take to market. Now, because of the large plantations that were in the South, a slave system was established. Most plantation owners used the gang labor system, and those slaves worked from sun up to sundown. This would be an example of gang labor. Slaves also worked as butlers, cooks, nurses in the planter's house, and some others were blacksmiths and carpenters. Slaves were considered property. The slave owner bought the slaves at an auction. Oftentimes, families were split apart. Slave houses, as you can see here, they weren't very good. They had dirt floors. They had few furnishings, but they were allowed to have a small garden if they would like. And the slaves were provided with very simple clothing, cheap clothing. There were laws out there in the South that prohibited slaves from reading and writing, and anyone who was caught teaching a slave how to read or write would then be punished either by a fine or through a whipping. Family was the most important aspect of slave communities, and they were always fearful that they would be split apart. So parents would constantly pass down their heritage to their children by telling them stories, like folk tales, or they would sing spirituals. These were a way to pass down their culture and heritage and customs to their children. And then their children would repeat it to their children, so on and so forth. Now, some of you may ask why more slaves didn't revolt or try to escape. And there were slave revolts, but they were very rare. But Southerners always feared them. I think they feared it more than they actually took place because they're always paranoid that a slave was going to rise up. Why do you think they didn't want him to read or write? They didn't want him to become educated because then they might be able to leave and have better ideas about leaving. But one slave revolt that did happen occurred in 1831. A slave named Nat Turner had this, I don't know, vision or heard maybe God speaking to him, but believed that God wanted him to end slavery and to kill all the white plantation owners. So he did lead a group of slaves that will kill some white plantation owners and their families. In all, he killed about 60 people, as well as 100 innocent slaves who were trying to just stop the rebellion from happening. This was known as Nat Turner's Rebellion. It's probably the most famous and biggest slave rebellion that took place. That is the end of chapter 13.